From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is Update One, the club's official podcast. It features newsworthy stories originating from the NPC facilities, as well as broader topics related to journalism, communications, press freedom, and transparency.
Welcome to another edition of the National Press Club Update One podcast. I'm podcast committee member Lincoln Smith, and with this conversation, we are joined by Cold War historians Gary Powers Jr. and Christopher Sturdevant, who have co-authored the book Cold War, Virginia. Welcome, Gary Powers and Christopher Sturdevant.
All right, Link, thanks for having us on.
Your book, Cold War, Virginia, opens with an introduction to the essential history of the Cold War. What was the Cold War?
Well, the Cold War was a period of time in world history from 1945 through 1991. We had tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was called a Cold War because a nuclear war did not happen. We did not have traditional battles where we were fighting each other on the battlefield. It was more of an espionage, covert, trying to find out the strengths and weaknesses of each other. It encompassed a space race, an arms race, nuclear buildup, and a lot of saber rattling, but no physical direct combat.
In the introduction, it says, quote, contrary to popular belief, the Cold War was anything but peaceful, end quote. Can you expand on this thought, Gary and Chris?
Well, take the Cold War shoot-downs. Between 1950 and 1970, there were some 35 Cold War shoot-downs, of which about 135 crew members are still unaccounted for. So this is just one example of that, and I'm sure Chris has some others.
The submarine accidents, USS Thresher, well over 100 men were killed in that, and the explosion under the sea, USS Scorpion. There were training accidents, the ones that Gary had mentioned, how many reconnaissance bombers retrofitted after the Second World War were doing reconnaissance over Eastern European countries, shot down many of those men unaccounted for. So I've seen some figures, upwards of 3,000 total that would be fit in the category of Cold War casualties.
And you can also mention the covert spies that were killed in the line of duty. In the CIA, there's a wall of honor with, I believe, 135 stars that represent field personnel who were killed in the line of duty. Some of them are still classified, so there's no name next to them. Others have been declassified, and their names are listed.
Now, we do list some of those names in the Cold War Virginia book under the CIA chapter. If you're talking even in a world context, how many people lost their lives trying to escape East Berlin into West? The last casualty, I believe, was someone trying to get through with a hot air balloon and was electrocuted in power lines. But even people that were trying to jump out of their windows of their apartments as the wall was going up in 1961, there's so many unnamed casualties that we probably don't even recognize or have figures for.
To include this loss of life, how do you think the Cold War shaped our American way of life?
Well, in many different ways, through pop culture and movies like Dr. Strangelove, the James Bond series. Those type of movies were influential to the American way of life, as well as defense and military spending, foreign policy, McCarthyism and the Red Scare. These are all aspects of how the Cold War shaped our American way of life. Chris?
And you could even do the baseline nuclear family, God. Communism was, of course, a godless political philosophy. Freedom of speech, being able to travel freely, all sorts of things that we understand as Americans and Western thought was really a crime in the Soviet Union and the communist regimes around Eastern Europe and China and so forth.
And overall, the Cold War's influence on the American way of life was extensive. It affected everything from international relations to domestic policies, cultural expressions, and even economic trends.
To the book title, the Commonwealth of Virginia is adjacent to the nation's capital. With this proximity, how did Virginia remain unique during the Cold War?
Virginia is home to the Pentagon, the CIA, multiple military bases, some clandestine locations where CIA or other agencies with trained operatives, Norfolk with the shipbuilding. I mean, that's all very unique to Virginia during the Cold War. Chris?
It's the epicenter of the decision-making, the planners, the generals, the diplomats, whereas you get into the heartland where I'm from, it's a little bit different. That the Cold War is not really seen so much is because we didn't really focus a lot on our military history, the shipyards that created the ships like the USS Pueblo. So it really was less interactive or less noticeable because I think less people worked in those fields. Like in Virginia, everybody probably had somebody or multiple people in their families, friends that worked in a lot of those agencies, and sometimes over careers, both or multiple agencies.
Some 256 Nike missile silos were built in the United States during the Cold War. To include location and purpose, tell us about these sites.
Well, the Nike missile program was extensive. It surrounded almost every major city: New York, LA, Miami, Washington, D.C., even Milwaukee. And at first, there were a certain type of Nike Ajax missiles that had conventional warheads. They were operational to help shoot down the Bear bombers or other enemy aircraft that would be trying to attack our cities in the event of a World War III. It eventually graduated to a Hercules Nike system. They were equipped with nuclear warheads. Chris?
The number that you cite, over 250, that would be the Ajax systems. Generally, the early 1950s, almost all were shut down by the 1970s. There were some systems in Florida that was still operational in the late 70s, even in South Korea and some other allied countries for the United States for missile defense. But of course, the whole scheme of the Nike, this was the last line of defense. Had the incoming bombers made it this far to American cities, the fight was supposed to be over, or plan on being over, Canada, because there were less people. So thus you had the distant early warning line, the near Canada line. And of course, if they got this far, we probably didn't have a chance. Some of the Nike veterans that I've met in this area have said that luckily maybe get off one or two missiles. If you go back to even crossings of the prior questions, these Nike systems were in neighborhoods. There were housing developments around them. People welcomed them for the most part in Eisenhower's America and Kennedy's America. So they were a welcome addition to a lot of these communities for the everyday American that lived near these cities.
And the Lorton Nike missile base in Northern Virginia, which was one of the sites to protect Washington, D.C., it was the premier Nike site. The politicians and the military would always take VIPs out to do tours there because it was their predominant one, the one that they like to showcase.
So those in Virginia, the ring around Washington, D.C. and Maryland, Northern Virginia, they all had a specific purpose. Some, as mentioned, they crossed state lines. The ones here, even in Wisconsin, crossed into the Minneapolis ring. But here in Wisconsin, we had 30 in the Milwaukee, Chicago, Gary ring. That, as Gary mentioned, they were upgraded. When they upgraded to the nuclear weapons, obviously the explosives were going to take out multiple long-range bombers that were more effective. And they, in that vein, they were able to shrink down multiple sites into just a handful because of the firepower. And it was also good for expenses because these military bases were very expensive to operate, and they were eventually phased out in the SALT treaties in the early 1970s while the Vietnam War was going on.
What was the role of the otherwise extensive satellite program during the Cold War?
Well, that's the Corona project initially. It was joined by Gambit and Hexagon. Initially, the Air Force was in charge of our satellite program, and then the National Reconnaissance Organization was devised to oversee that. And it was built to work in conjunction with our U-2 overflights, Oxcart, and then afterwards, of course, the SR-71. We had to rely heavily on the satellites once Gary's father was shot down in 1960. And it evolved from, the canisters that would be dropping from the sky. The cargo planes would have to go pick them up and then have, the analysis up to today where it can just instantaneously photograph and send information to be analyzed by the respective agency. So it's really come a long way.
Yeah, and with the satellites of the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO is located in Chantilly, Virginia. And that is one of the organization that is responsible for all of our spy satellites today, as well as during the Cold War.
How might you compare and contrast the administrations of President John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan during the Cold War era?
Well, Kennedy, of course, was Democrat and Reagan was Republican. There's a, compare and contrast right there. One was assassinated. Another one, an attempted assassination on his life, Reagan, by Hinckley back in the 80s. And then as far as their political ideologies, strategic defense, the SDI under Reagan, Kennedy was going for, hey, let's get a man to the moon, the space race. So there are some similarities as well as some differences between the two, but they both took place during the Cold War time period. Chris?
So they both had a hard line against the Soviets, but also utilized any negotiating through summits. Kennedy visited with Khrushchev. Reagan always quipped that he would meet with a Soviet leader, but that kept dying on him. The Brezhnev died, Chernenko died, so Andropov died. Gorbachev was around enough to kind of see the writing on the wall a little bit, try to loosen up things in the Soviet Union. And so that became a very big rapport at the end of the Cold War, signing INF treaty. Kennedy had signed the nuclear test ban treaty. So you had some treaties that were signed amongst both. And they each had a role in giving major speeches at the Berlin Wall. So they have a lot of similarities in their style. The end result, of course, was to hopefully win the Cold War.
Chapter 5 of the book, entitled, quote, Woodrow Wilson and the Origins of the Cold War, end quote, spotlights President Wilson's centralizing of power in Washington, D.C. during his term in office, along with geopolitical realities between the United States and former Soviet Union. Did the actions of President Wilson set the stage for the Cold War, and if so, how?
Well, certainly the 20th century, and that's probably an odd name to bring up when you talk about Cold War history. One of the big tenets you mentioned is the centralizing of power in government. And when you have an income tax that is signed under his watch, the Federal Reserve, the ability to spend money, that gives the ascending nation that we were at that time a lot of clout on the national stage. We entered a war in World War I under his watch. He had helped pass the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act. The Espionage Act was used later to, the Eisenbergs were convicted under those laws and many other future spies in the 20th century. And he also made the decision to intervene into Russia at the behest of Winston Churchill. Once the Tsars had left, the Tsar was toppled by the Bolsheviks, they pulled out of World War I, and the local Russians were scared. The Allies were scared in general, because then you freed up how many hundreds of thousands of Kaiser Germans to go to the Western Front. But then you had local Soviets asking for protection. And so the Americans contributed 5,000 troops into North Russia. And Wilson also authorized 8,000 troops to fight in the Russian Civil War in Siberia. So there's a lot of clashing going on, deaths occurring. We had several hundred deaths in both spheres as far as American service personnel. And so you really have the foothold or the origins of the relationship between the early Soviet government and the United States take shape. And we didn't really even recognize the Soviet Union until 1933 when FDR took over. So there's a huge history before World War II. This is clearly atomic age we're talking about here, and when the stakes get a little bit higher because of nuclear weapons and the brinksmanship that it took during the Cold War to end.
And in Wilson's policies and the international consequences of his approach to post-World War I diplomacy, that really contributed to the broader context in which the Cold War tensions developed.
Part of the Cold War history was Atoms for Peace. What was Atoms for Peace?
some Eisenhower's way to give maybe an alternative means to use nuclear energy, nuclear power for a peaceful means for humanity. We had just fresh gotten off of, in 1952, the hydrogen bomb had been tested. The Soviets got it in 1949, the atomic bomb. Of course, we used it in World War II to end the Second World War in Japan. So the nuclear race was up and running fast and getting out of control. So Eisenhower had the idea to use nuclear power in the form of ships. He had the ideas of research and using them in plants, types of grapefruit, types of roses and flowers, medical imaging. So that the biggest one that we point out in the book, of course, is the USS Savannah, which is a cargo ship that is based on nuclear power and usage. Wasn't really in operation that long. It cost a lot of money. It's been decommissioned for quite a long time. It's in Maryland, I believe, right now. But that was just a way for the United States to step in, and Eisenhower in particular, to diffuse some of the tensions that were going on with the use of nuclear power and the use for nuclear weapons.
In the book, you detail the formation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Can you briefly highlight this formation?
Well, yes. The CIA was created in 1947 as part of the National Security Act. It was developed as a way to find out the strengths and weaknesses of our adversaries around the world. Its predecessor was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, headed by Wild Bill Donovan. And he was in charge of getting his agents in behind enemy lines in World War II. That would be doing the saboteuring, the blowing up of the heavy water plants in Germany, and trying to get the secrets of the Nazis and the Japanese and the Italians to see what their strengths and weaknesses were. So the CIA over the last 50 years of the Cold War, 47 to 91, played a pivotal role behind the scenes, clandestinely, to find out and protect America's people at home.
To espionage as a weapon during the Cold War, can you spotlight some prime examples?
Well, one of them, of course, is the U-2 incident. Now, a weapon in a traditional sense is something that is going to be like a gun or a rifle or a missile or something. But the U-2 incident was a high reconnaissance aircraft. It was used by the U.S. to monitor Soviet military activities. And in May of '60, my dad was shot down while on a mission over the Soviet Union. So a weapon in the traditional sense, that was not, but it's still a weapon in our arsenal that was gathering intelligence. Chris?
Also through some of our networks after the Cold War, the Galen organization operating behind the Iron Curtain, that could be sabotaging buildings, could be sabotaging weapons plants, going after any Eastern or Iron Curtain countries, aircraft, missiles, tanks, anything, water supply, power, shutting down the power. So there are, again, as Gary mentioned, probably not in the traditional sense, but covertly acting as individual units can do a lot of damage to the enemy.
Right. And another example would be the Berlin Tunnel from 54 to 56. Going across the Iron Curtain in Berlin, under the Berlin Wall, from West Germany to from West Berlin to East Berlin. And it was monitoring and tapping into their communication center to find out what messages were being sent back and forth, not only to East German units, but also to Soviet units. So it's another quote unquote weapon, but not in the traditional sense.
Gary, you've touched on your father's shoot down during the Cold War. What was the significance of the Francis Gary Powers U-2 incident to the Cold War?
Well, the U-2 incident that took place May 1st of 1960 resulted in the collapse of the Paris Summit Conference. That was one of the major significances. It actually did convene. Khrushchev, de Gaulle, Eisenhower, the British Prime Minister all showed up in Paris, France, May 16th of that year. Khrushchev stands up, demands an Eisenhower apology. Eisenhower refuses to apologize. Khrushchev storms out, and the summit conference implodes. It looks as if the Cold War is about to heat up. It's also significant because it showed the world that Eisenhower, the United States, were spying on a foreign country. It was the first time that an American president had been caught lying to the American public. Eisenhower indicated at first that it was a weather research flight. But then Khrushchev was able to show the plane wreckage and the pilot alive, and it was a very big embarrassment to the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower realized that he had to save his legacy. He had to save his reputation. He had two choices at the time. He could blame Allen Dulles for this rogue operation that was not successful, but he realized that if he did that, that then public opinion would think that he was not in charge of his own country. So instead, during his press conference, Eisenhower stands up. He takes full responsibility for his actions. He calls his actions, quote unquote, a vital but distasteful necessity in order to avert another Pearl Harbor. And while all this was going on for the first 2-3 weeks of May 1960, my father's in a Soviet prison, Lubyanka, going through interrogations, holding back as much information as he can, trying to mislead the enemy any way he can to prevent the release of secret information. So a couple of the significances was the Paris Summit Conference collapsing and Eisenhower getting caught lying.
Gary, you founded the Cold War Museum. Tell us about the museum.
Well, I founded the museum in 1996 to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, and educate students on this time period. At first, I was giving lectures in Northern Virginia back in 92 to 95 or so. I'd walk into a classroom. I'd get blank stares from the kids. They thought I was there to talk about the U2 rock band, not the U2 incident. And so from that moment on, I realized something had to be done to preserve Cold War history. I also realized that our Cold War veterans were not being recognized for their service to our country. The Cold War, there were casualties. Hundreds, thousands of men and women fought, sacrificed, some of which who died during this conflict. And I thought it was very important to recognize their service to our country. So I founded the museum in 96. We got a permanent home at Vint Hill, Virginia, which is another wonderful military base used during the Cold War to monitor the communications of our enemies. It's an authentic Cold War historic site. The museum is opened on the weekends, has a great collection of artifacts, civil defense, items from the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, items from the USS Pueblo, the USS Liberty incident, the U-2 incident, as well as artifacts from Vint Hill, which was a Cold War base. More information online for the Cold War Museum can be found at coldwar.org. And then Chris is our Midwest chapter president. That's how I know Chris. We go back some 25 years. He's heading up the effort in Waukesha, Wisconsin, to preserve a Nike facility there. I want to say the relay station for the Nike missile system up there in Waukesha. And this is one of the reasons we decided to partner on this book, Cold War Virginia, is because of our long-term friendship as well as our mutual interest in Cold War history.
In closing, do you believe the Cold War to be over?
Let me tell you a quick story. Back in 98, 99, I'm founding the museum. I'm trying to get artifacts. I'm trying to get support. I reach out to a retired KGB officer who I am a friend with. I asked her to say, hey, I'm looking to see if we can get some artifacts from the KGB, a few small items to put on display, show their side of Cold War history. Well, she runs it up the flagpole. She comes back with me in an answer in about 2 months. She says to me, Gary, I received a reply. They told me he will get no help from us. The Cold War is not over. That was in 98-ish. And now you look around, you got the war in Ukraine, you've got Putin, who's very Stalin-esque. You've got the things in Gaza as well as Israel that's going on there. Now, the Middle East conflict goes back to biblical times. But in 1947, Israel becomes a state, a Cold War event. Palestine does not. And the tensions have just increased since that time. So you can tie the Middle East conflict right now, as well as the war in Ukraine, to the Cold War time period.
Gary Powers and Christopher Sturdevant, authors of the book Cold War Virginia. Thank you for joining us on the National Press Club Update 1 podcast.
Thanks for having us.
All right, Link. Thank you.
You have been listening to Update 1, the official podcast of the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists and a vigorous advocate of press freedom worldwide. If you have any questions or comments about Update 1, send an email to update1podcast at gmail.com.